Hi, I'm Pastor Colin Brooks, and I'm here to welcome you to the online content for Living Water Bible Fellowship. On behalf of Living Water, it is our prayer that our videos here would challenge you, encourage you, and edify you through the preaching and teaching of God's Word. However, it is our intention that our online content be used for supplementary purposes only. Our online content is not here to replace regular worship with God's people. We would exhort you, if you are not already, to find a local church in your area that is biblical, Christ-adoring, and gospel-centered, and become a member of that body. We, as a staff here at Living Water, just would like to thank you for viewing our videos. We hope you enjoy. God bless.
What comes into your mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you. What comes into your mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you. That's a quote from an old theologian by the name of A.W. Tozer, and it's been one of my favorite quotations my entire life. I believe it to be very true. That there is nothing more important about you than who you say God is. That's the most important thing about you. Who is God? Who is the God that you worship? Who's the God in your mind? Nothing could be more important. It'd be interesting to have asked Moses while he was shepherding his father-in-law's flock what he thought about God. It would have been interesting to ask Moses, who is God? I'm not sure Moses had a lot of revelation to work with, but by the grace of God, we come to our place in Exodus where God is about to make his grand entrance in the book of Exodus. God, if we are just sort of reading through as a story, Genesis through Exodus, God's kind of fallen off the map. He hasn't spoken in a long time. He hasn't interacted in any kind of crazy, miraculous way in a long time. He's been seemingly pretty absent. Well, God finally makes his grand appearance in the well-known passage of the burning bush. If you would please open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 3. Now, we are going to cover the entire chapter of Exodus 3. So we'll be reading a lot of text today, and we will not be, I wanted us to see this narrative all together. We're not going to be picking out all of what's here. Every single verse, in many ways, is a sermon in and of itself. So who knows, Drawn and Bo, they may want to go back and cover things in Exodus 3, and that's fine, but there's an important, I think, overall thesis that I want us to see as Moses interacts with God for the first time in this way. So it'll be a long chapter, but I would ask if you would please follow along, for these are God's very words to us. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight. Why is this bush not burned? When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land into a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, But I will be with you. And this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And God also said to Moses, Say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt. Verse 17. And I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And they will listen to your voice. And you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. And now, please, let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it, and after that he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and when you go, you shall not go empty. But each woman shall ask of her neighbor, and any woman who lives in her house, for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing, and you shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians. So God has told Moses the end of the story, the end of the Exodus, how the Exodus is going to take place. God condescends and preaches gospel to Moses. He preaches good news to him that God has come down to redeem and rescue people from their bondage, his people. God has preached the good news to Moses, and Moses responds with what we see as 4 objections, because this dialogue carries into chapter 4. And from chapters 3 and 4, Moses basically has 4 objections. And the first 2 are in our text this morning. And I want us to see how those 2 questions really develop for us the thesis of chapter 3. Now, I don't consider these questions on Moses' end to be objections yet. Most commentators will say Moses was stubborn and he was fighting God. That does happen in chapter 4. He starts making really lame excuses to get out of his job, and God gets really angry with him. But I think the 2 objections that he raises here are not displeasing to God. I think they're very good questions. I think they're very natural questions. I think they're the very thoughts that were we in his bare feet, if you will, would ask of God as well. And Moses basically asks the question, in light of this grand story of redemption, he asks 2 questions: who am I and who are you? Who am I and who are you? 2 of the most fundamental questions any human being can ask. Who am I? Who is God? Because you see, the plan that God has laid out for Moses is amazing, right? Let's recap the plot. Moses has been in Midian for 40 years at this point. His days in Egypt are long over. He's got a full-fledged, brand new life now. And he is taking his father-in-law's sheep. He doesn't even own the sheep. He's watching his father-in-law's sheep. And he takes them pretty far to the Mount Horeb, which is the same thing as Mount Sinai. Sinai's either a range in the mountain range of Horeb, or they're the same mountain with the sides being named differently. Scholars disagree on that. But we know, historically, biblically, Sinai, Horeb, same thing. So Moses comes to Sinai and he sees a miracle. He sees a bush that's on fire but not being burned. Now, we talked about miracles a couple weeks ago. That's impossible. You can't set a bush on fire and not burn the bush. Either there's no fire or the bush is getting burned. It can't happen, but it is. So obviously this attracts him. Moses says, I got to check this out. That bush isn't burning. And God's plan worked. Moses is drawn, and God speaks to Moses, tells Moses of this plan to bring Israel out of Egypt, to bring them into a new land, to redeem them and prosper them. And Moses has 2 questions before we begin. Who am I and who are you? And this tells us an important application before we answer those 2 questions. And here's one thing we need to remember. I hope, pray, and believe that this is not new to us. But in case it is, let's say it anyway. One of the overarching things we take away from this text is that God is the God who reveals himself to us. God is not a God that we get to shape in our own likeness. God is not the God we get to define. We don't get to tell God who he is. He gets to tell us who he is. We live in a culture nowadays that loves to fashion gods in our own image. If I love this, God must love this too. If I affirm this behavior, God must affirm this behavior too. If I want to live this way, God must want me to live this way. We make God who just happens to look, sound, and be pleased by everything about me. But that is not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is not defined by us. He self-discloses himself. He speaks to us. He says, this is who I am objectively. You can take it or leave it. When God speaks, when God says, this is who I am, and we don't like it, we change, not God. God reveals himself to us. He's revealed himself to Moses. He's revealed this plan of redemption to Moses. Moses didn't make this up. God spoke to him. God condescended to him. And so Moses' first question is, who am I? Now, Moses is not having an existential crisis here. Here's what I mean by that. He's not asking this deep ontological question, like Plato, like, well, who am I anyways? Do I even exist? Moses is not looking for a boost of self-esteem. Moses is not, shucks, God, I'm such a loser. Don't pick me. The way we debase ourselves when we're technically actually fishing for compliments. Tell me how good I am, because I'm a nobody. That's not what's happening here. He's asking a very practical, pragmatic question. He's not having an identity crisis. He's not lost his identity or lost his self-esteem. He's simply saying, how can I? I tried already. It didn't work. And that was 40 years ago. I'm an old man now. I've lost my political power. I've lost my influence. I've lost my health. I failed at the task already. How could I possibly go up against the most powerful man in the world and deliver an oppressed minority people? I can't do that. Why me? So what's God's answer for Moses? Who is Moses? Well, God's answer in summary is this: you're nobody. You're no one. Where do I get that from? Moses asks who I am, and God doesn't answer him. God doesn't say, you're Moses. You're the most brilliant of all the Hebrews. You're the boldest man of all my creation. He doesn't say a lick about Moses, but he says something about himself. It doesn't matter who you are, Moses. I'm with you. Moses is nobody, but God is somebody, and that's all that matters. And this is the promise, which is why Moses should not have objected in chapter 4. And this is not a promise just given to Moses. It is here in this text. But this is a foundational promise of New Testament teaching that gives every Christian in this room hope. Because what does Jesus tell his disciples before his ascension during the Great Commission, Matthew 28? He sends them out into the world. Go evangelize the world. Go win the whole world for me. I'm leaving. You're going to do it without me, but go win the entire world. And how can we possibly, this group of 11 nobodies, win the world? And Jesus says, I will be with you to the end of the age. Paul writes in Romans chapter 8, if God is for us, who can be against us? If God is for us, what can we fear? What should we fear? The hope we have to get our feet out of bed every morning is this promise, I will be with you. So it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter who you are. God is with us. He's with his church. He's with his people. He's with Moses. So what we see here is what God is trying to tell Moses. This is not a clash between Israel and Egypt. This is not a clash between Moses and Pharaoh. This is a clash between God and Egypt. You see, Egypt are the underdogs, not the Israelites. The story of David and Goliath, I always thought David the underdog. David wasn't the underdog. Goliath was the underdog. Because Goliath and Pharaoh were fighting without God. They were the underdogs. They had no hope. God is saying, Pharaoh has no hope, not because Moses is so great, because I'm so great. It doesn't matter who Moses is, it matters who God is. And so that brings us to the next question then, who is God? Who is God? You see, Moses was in a desert in more than one way. He was in a physical desert, Midian, certainly. But Moses was in a bit of a spiritual desert as well. Moses was thirsty for more of God. Moses was craving, Moses desired more of God. Think about their cultural context. They don't have a Bible. They don't have something to study. They don't have very much revelation at all. They've got oral tradition from their grandpa. Their grandfathers allegedly covenanted with some God who made a bunch of promises which we're not seeing happen. And that's what he's got. The name that God gives Moses, it shows up in Genesis. This isn't the first time, but it falls off from Jacob's lineage on. For hundreds and hundreds of years, the Israelites have been in a pagan culture surrounded by foreign religions, foreign deities, and they haven't heard a word from God in hundreds of years. Moses needs more. I can't do this for you. I don't even know who you are. I know you made a covenant to Abraham. We know that. Moses knew that he was following the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But that's about it. Who is God? Who is God to Moses? Now, what's amazing is all of chapter 3 is filled, it's riddled with amazing implications of some of the characteristics and attributes of God. There's a ton of them there we could spend all day talking about. For example, we see that God is holy. Holiness is going to be one of the most important themes throughout the book of Exodus. Right when Moses finally approaches God, he says, no, don't approach me. Stay back. Take your shoes off. This is holy ground. You're in the presence of a holy God. And Moses hides his face. He's afraid to look at God because the Bible tells us that the holiness of God could literally kill you. When Moses just barely sees a glimpse of God's holiness on Sinai, it changes his face so much that 1 Corinthians tells us he had to put a veil over it. God's holiness is altogether unlike us. The angels in heaven for all eternity, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. God is holy. We see that in this text. We see a lot more. We see he's faithful. He told him, I'm the God of your fathers, because he's trying to tell him, I have come here to do what I promised. I've come here to fulfill what I have vowed. He is perfectly faithful. He's omnipresent. The same God talking to Moses in Midian is the same God who understands what's happening in Egypt. He's everywhere. We see his compassion and his mercy, that he cares so much for these Hebrew people he really doesn't have to care about, but he loves them and he's heartbroken over their affliction. We see that he's righteous. He recognizes that what Egypt is doing, he calls it oppression. He sees that Egypt is wrong. They're sinful. They're abusing people, which is why he's going to go in and plunder them. This is retribution for their sin. He is righteous. We see that he's omniscient. He knows all things. He knows what Pharaoh's going to do. He knows how the Jewish elders are going to respond. He knows the future. He knows Moses is going to return to this mountain. He's perfectly aware of all things that are happening. We see he's omnipotent, which means he's all-powerful. He's going to destroy the greatest force on the face of the earth like it's nothing. Nothing can stop God from accomplishing his purposes. We see he's personal, that he's actually interacting and speaking our language and talking to us. We see so much about who God is in this text, but what we need to focus in on is the main answer he gives Moses. All of that was implication, but he gives an explicit revelation of himself, and it comes in the form of a name tag. Moses asks, who do I say that you are? What's your name? Who are you? Now, to ask for a name is more than just asking for a title. Especially, and this was true of the Hebrew culture at large, but especially when talking about God, his name represents and reflects who he is. For example, Philippians chapter 2 says that after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, he ascended to heaven, and then he received what? The name that is above all other names. What does that mean? That Jesus is not special, but his name is really cool. He's okay, but the name is awesome. No. To receive the name above all the other names is saying that he is above all others. Jesus tells us how to pray to our Father. Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be what? Your name. What are we supposed to do? God, we're not here to worship you, just your name. No. To worship the name of God is to worship God. That's why the Psalms will often say things like, those who know the name of the Lord will put their trust in him. Knowing God's name means you know who he is, which means you know he's trustworthy and reliable. So Moses is not just simply saying, give me a title. In the Hebrew culture, the nature of God, Moses is saying, give me you. Who are you? How do I know, how are the Hebrews going to know you're any different than any of the other plethora of gods that Egypt wants us to worship? There's hundreds of gods in that land. How are you not just 101? How are you different? How are you unique? Who are you? Moses is thirsty to know God. And so God tells him. He answers him, verse 13. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. A bit circular, isn't it? Who are you, God? I'm God. Okay, well, I know that, but who are you? I'm God. This doesn't seem like he gave him very much information, does it? On the contrary, he does. God gives Moses a name in the Hebrew, which is a present tense verb. It's an ongoing verb. It's an action. It'd be like if you asked someone on the street, what's your name? And they said, I'm running. Oh, sorry, see you later. I'll talk to you later. No, that's who I am. I'm running. It's a present ongoing verb, but it's more of a verb than just running or jumping or kicking. It's existence. You could translate this in verse 14 as, I will be who I will be. I am who I am. I will be who I will be. And then he shortens this to give him a little bit more precise of a name. And he said, say this, is verse 14, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Who is God? He's the great I am. Now, what does that mean? The word I am in your English Bibles comes from the Hebrew. Now, this is kind of a big word, but it's a fun thing to learn if you want to impress your friends at a dinner party. It comes from what we call the Tetragrammaton. And that is 4 Hebrew consonants, because the Hebrews didn't write with vowels, which translated to the English letters, we get YHWH, which over time, church history, was actually kind of a messy process. Long story short, we started pronouncing that Yahweh. We don't know if that's how Moses pronounced it, but the closest scholars have gotten, we feel pretty good about it. God's name is Yahweh. The Tetragrammaton. And what this present ongoing verb, this present existence is saying here is actually a lot. God has revealed to Moses some incredible things with this name. For example, we see that God is eternal. God has no beginning, God has no end. Why? Because he is presently ongoing always. You can go back 150 billion years, God is. Go 150 billion years in the future, God is. Go where there is no time, God is. Go where there will be no time, God is. He is always existing. He always is. Always in the present tense. He is absolutely eternal. He never says, I was like that. I will be like that. I am. Always, I am. This eternal, unchanging God. As a matter of fact, Jesus uses this text in Matthew 22 to prove to the Sadducees of resurrection. God is presently, right now, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's God. He wasn't their God in the past. They're still alive. He exists eternally. He's still their God now. He's the eternal God. He is unchanging. I will be something else? No, I will be what I will be. I am what I am. He's unchanging. The book of Hebrews describes Jesus as being the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. God does not change. He is not fickle. He can't change his character, decide he can't be what he's supposed to be. He is. He always will be, and he is. He's the eternal, unchanging God. We also see in this, he's self-sufficient. God doesn't do what we have to do. If I wanted to tell you who I was, I would have to relate my existence to other existences. I'm this, I'm not this, I'm like this, I'm not like this. We, in this universe, this material universe, are living depending upon different things always, in relation to different things always. We need fuel, we need food, we sleep, we're inconsistent, we die. We need to be fueled. We are at all times dependent on other things. We exist because some other people brought us into this world. We feed because food exists and people give us things. We are dependent upon everything else, and we find our definition in relation to everything else. But how does God define himself before there's anything to compare to? In eternity, there was nothing but God. How does God define himself? All there is God. So what would God say? Who is God? I am. That's all there is. You see, God is self-sufficient. He doesn't need anything. He doesn't need something else to define him. He doesn't need something else to keep him going. He exists just like the burning bush, on fire, constantly burning, not consuming anything. He goes for all eternity, unchanging, in need of absolutely nothing. He is self-sufficient. Before he created anything, the Holy Trinity was perfectly fine, in need of nothing. And lastly, this implies that he is the creator. He's the creator God. If he's what's eternal and everything else is cause and effect, dependency, then he's the ultimate cause. He has given life and breath to everything, as Paul says in Acts 17. He has made everything. He is, by nature of being the I am, the creator of everything that's not him. He's what's eternal. Everything else isn't. Everything else finds its definition and its existence from him. There is a school of thought called existentialism, philosophy. And existentialism presupposes there is no God and starts with mankind as sort of the I am of the worldview. So here's the problem. Who is man? How do I even know I exist? And the most famous of existential philosophers came up with this famous proof for my own existence. I think, therefore I am. They try to make himself the great I am. I have no ultimate cause. I think, therefore I am. Thankfully, Christian philosophers came along to expose how absurd that is. Because here's the problem. The conclusion comes in the premise. Who's the I thinking? You're trying to prove you exist. You just assumed you exist when you said you think. Let me simplify it for you. You want to believe in leprechauns? Leprechauns think, therefore they are. Unicorns think, therefore they are. This doesn't prove existence. That's why Christian philosophers came along and fixed the equation. God is, therefore you think. We exist. Everything you see is dependent upon the eternal, unchanging Creator. Nothing has meaning, nothing has existence, nothing has reality unless God is. That's what he told Moses. He said, you go tell that to the Israelites. That's why we can't define anything without this objective standard. People will say things like, well, I can't believe in the God of the Bible because he does all these horrible things. What is a horrible thing? The world is just matter in motion. Stuff collides. Who are you to say it's wrong when it collides like this? You see, if you want ethics, morality, look to God. You can't use ethics against God because you don't have ethics without him. If you want unchanging, eternal, immaterial ethics, you need an unchanging, eternal, immaterial God. Same thing with logic. People say, well, the Bible's filled with contradictions. Where do you get logic without the great I am? What is logic and reasoning? You can't touch it, you can't taste it, you can't smell it. It's invisible. It's unchanging. We don't say that contradictions work in Nebraska, but they don't work in California. It's universal, unchanging. Sounds a lot like the character and nature of God. If there is no universal, unchanging, immaterial God, then what is logic? My brain is fizzing one way, your brain is fizzing another way, and there's no transcendent standard to tell me which one of those random biological fizzes is logical. It's just fizz. It's just chemical reactions. God is the standard of all things. You want science? Who is God? You want logic? Who is God? You want reason? Who is God? You want ethics? Who is God? We define and find meaning in everything in relation to who God is. Because he is the eternal, self-sufficient one. All things depend and find relation and definition to his existence. Because he is the creator of all things. And this makes him altogether unlike the pagan deities. Because all pagan deities, the Egyptians, Zeus, they came from the creation. Study them. That's why it drives me bonkers when people say things like, well, why should I believe in Yahweh over Zeus? You want to know why? Because Zeus is an atheist. Even Zeus himself believes that the natural world is the I am. That the material world, existence as there was in Zeus, came from that existence. There's only 3 religions in the world. Only 3. There's Christianity, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's Christian cults, people who say they worship that God, but don't. Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons. And then there's atheism. The material world is all there is and everything comes from it. Those are the only 3 religions. Pagan deities is just atheism with a little bit more imagination. But it still says the creation is all there is. But Yahweh says, no, I am, and the creation now has existence and meaning because of me. This world is not just atoms that came from nowhere bouncing around together. And even if that was the case, you couldn't attach any meaning to that. God gives meaning. God gives existence. Without the I am, without an unchanging, eternal God, we have no such thing as meaning, existence. You can't even know you exist unless God has spoken and God is. That's the God of the Hebrews. That's the God who promises to deliver Moses. That's the God we can trust. And so here's kind of what I take from all of this, an application, if you will. Theology matters. Theology is really important. I'm not at all speaking of this church. I have been pleased and blessed by the preaching of this church, by the teachings in the classes and the communication. I'm not talking about Living Water. But I have an Instagram, and I have a Facebook, and I have a Twitter, and I see conversations and the preaching from pastors all around the country that would either explicitly or implicitly communicate to you that theology doesn't matter. That it's just, when someone cares about theology, they're immediately written off as this divisive egghead. One pastor once said that if you're looking to come here into this church and just get fat on theology, you can leave. We're not here to get fat on theology and sit on our rear ends and get fat on theology. We're here to love the community and change the world. We're here to love people. First of all, that's a theological statement. Second of all, you can do both. You can do both. Third of all, what did Jesus tell Peter to do before Jesus left Peter? Feed my sheep. Feed them. They're hungry. They're like Moses. They're famished for more of me, so give it to them. Jesus absolutely wants churches filled with big, fat sheep. Filled to the brim with more of God. Because who God is matters. Who God is matters. And it's important that we're specific. The Egyptians believed in God. Lots of people believe in God. Romans chapter 1 says everyone believes in God, even atheists. That's what Romans 1 says. Everyone you know believes in God. That's not enough. Who is the God we worship? We need to know that. We need to know what makes God different from the Mormon God when they come knocking on my door. What makes God different from the Jehovah's Witnesses God when they come knocking on my door? How is God different? Who is He really? What has He said? These questions matter for all Christians. It mattered to Moses. It mattered so much to Moses. God, give me more of you. Theology has become a bad word in Christian culture. You find sermon after sermon after sermon, which are no more than a TED Talk sprinkled with a couple Bible verses. I went through Instagram this week and just started listening to some of the most popular teachers I could find. And you know what I heard a lot of? 12 ways to accelerate your blessings. How to step into blessing. How to achieve financial and economic freedom. How to block out the voices of your haters. It's scratching itching ears. It's telling people how great they are, encouraging them, self-empowerment, self-esteem, and yet all the while we don't know who God is. Ligonier is an awesome resource I recommend to many. They baptize babies, but we'll forgive them. And they do a study every 2 years, examining, they call it the state of theology. They examine the Christian culture. What do Christians believe about God? Who do they say that God is? And every 2 years it gets worse. From 2018, the statement, God accepts the worship of all religions, including Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, 51% of Christians agree. Over half of people who say they're Christians aren't Christians. It gets worse. This is straight from Jehovah's Witness theology. Jesus is the first and greatest being created by God. 78% of professing evangelicals agree. 4% are unsure. Too excited. That means 81% of Christians are basically Jehovah's Witnesses, which means that 81% of triangles are circular. We don't know who God is, but we flock out of our churches every week super excited, pumped up, ready for my 12-step plan for economic freedom. But who is God? This is not to say there's no place for encouragement. Exodus 3 is a text of encouragement. You don't think it was encouraging? You don't think Moses was pretty excited eventually to know God's going to, use me to conquer nations and deliver his people? There's good news at the end of the story. It's encouraging. If you were to preach through the Bible, you would preach a lot of encouraging sermons. Sermons on the importance of marriage, the importance of relationships. The Bible is a very encouraging book. But when that's the goal, when that's all it becomes, is self-esteem, self-motivation, and we lose who God is, that encouragement, as Ecclesiastes says, is vain. We need to know who God is. And honestly, learning about God should encourage us more than any 12-step plan. You should be far more encouraged. Your heart should burn so much brighter hearing about how God knows all things and accomplishes all his purposes and is holy beyond all recognition. That should excite you so much more than accentuating the positivity in your language. God should make us far more excited than anything else. Every week we learn about God should be an encouraging week. We should leave here encouraged to meet with God, to hear from him, and to learn more about him. And so I want to end with that last statistic about Jesus. Turn to Isaiah chapter 6. Is Jesus a created being? Some of you in here, might say, "Wow, Colin, you really went harsh on me. I didn't know that." Well, let's learn it now. Isaiah chapter 6. Beginning in verse 1, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings, and 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another, and he said, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called. And I said, "Woe is me, for I am lost. I am a man of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Lord, in verse 3 and in verse 5, underneath that word is the tetragrammaton, Yahweh. So who did Isaiah see? He saw the unchanging, eternal God. He saw Yahweh. He saw the Lord, all caps. And then what's important is Yahweh sends Isaiah on a mission, verse 10, that Isaiah is going to preach and the people aren't going to listen, that God will make the heart of this people dull and their ears are heavy, and he will blind their eyes lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed. So that happens in the Old Testament. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later, the Apostle John gives an interesting interpretation of this. Turn to John chapter 12. In John chapter 12, beginning in verse 17. Or forgive me, verse 36, the second half of 36. When Jesus had said these things, he departed and hid himself from the people. Though he had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe in him, so that the words spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Lord, who has believed what he heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? That's Isaiah 53. But then he applies Isaiah 6 to Jesus as well. Therefore they could not believe in Jesus. For again, Isaiah said, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, lest they see with their eyes, understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. So that's from Isaiah 6. And guess what John says about it in verse 41? Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory and spoke of him. Who does the him go back to in this text? Follow the antecedents, Jesus. That's why some of the translations like the NIV will put Jesus into verse 41. Who did Isaiah see? Did he see Yahweh or did he see Jesus? Yes. Turn back to John chapter 8. Jesus, after preaching about himself and his relationship to his Father, he says in 56, he's speaking to the Pharisees, he says, your father Abraham rejoiced that you would see my day. He saw it and was glad. So Jesus is claiming to know Abraham. Abraham's been dead a long time. So the Pharisees ask him, or forgive me, all the Jews ask him, verse 57, so the Jews said to him, you are not 50 years old, and yet you've seen Abraham. You're not hundreds and hundreds of years old. You don't know Abraham. How can you know Abraham? You're not even 50. What does Jesus say? Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. He doesn't say, I was. He doesn't speak in the past tense like the grammar requires. Before Abraham was, I am. And don't think for a moment, if you think, oh, you're stretching that, he's not claiming to be the great I am, then tell me this, why verse 59? So they picked up stones to throw at him. They tried to stone him to death for claiming to be really old because he claimed to be Yahweh, the great I am. Jesus is not a created being. He is the creator of all created beings, as Colossians says. Nothing came into existence but through him. He is the eternal, unchanging creator of all the universe, and 78% of our churches don't know that. Theology matters. Study matters. Knowing God matters. Would you stand? I began with a quote from Tozer, and so I would like to end with a prayer from Tozer. So I would ask, would you bow your heads and close your eyes and make this our corporate prayer as a church this evening. Oh God, we have tasted thy goodness, and it has both satisfied us and made us thirst for more. We are painfully conscious of our need for further grace. We are ashamed of our lack of desire. Oh God, the triune God, we want to want thee. We long to be filled with longing, and we thirst to be made more thirsty still. Show us your glory, we pray, so that we may know you indeed. Amen.
Thank you again for viewing our online content at Living Water Bible Fellowship. If you were encouraged or edified by anything you heard, I would encourage you to go ahead and click the subscribe button, and by doing that, you will be receiving regularly the sermons that we put online. And we would also like to invite you, if you do not have a relationship with Christ Jesus, a saving relationship through the gospel where your sins have been forgiven, please feel free to contact us. You can go to our website at www.livingwateralamosa.org, and you can either email one of the pastors there or give us a call, and we would love to talk to you about Jesus Christ and the gospel that saves sinners. Thanks for watching. God bless.